All right, guys, the Flexible here with Adam Bighill. We're gonna go over day 2 of your stretch routine. Okay, the first 2 stretches are the same exact stretches from day 1. All you have to do is repeat those, okay? A lot of football players, you spend a lot of time in your cleats, and if you're not in your cleats, you're in tennis shoes in the gym. So stretching your toes and your ankles is super important. You can do it pretty frequently, so that's why it's in the same program you see it again, okay? So for this, we'll just jump straight into what I call the fisherman stretch, which is basically just working on ankle dorsiflexion, okay? So if you're one of those big guys at the line, usually your ankles are all taped up, which actually limits your ankle flexibility. So this we're gonna work on 2 different variations that you can use, okay? The first one I'll show standing up, just because it's really simple. You get your block. So Adam will put his foot up on his block, just like the day 1 calf stretch. The only difference is now he's actually going to try to bend the knee and push the knee out over the toe. Okay, so if he were trying to really actually push the knee out over the toe, he's going to feel the stretch now is going to shift from up here down into the lower part of the ankle. And you can see that the excessive angle, almost 45 degrees of the foot, and the knee going out over the toe is going to emulate your squatting position, and then of course just your ankle mobility needed for running and jumping and things like that. If you don't want to do this variation, you could do another variation where you're just kneeling. So if Adam wants to go down to the floor, he's simply going to go down like he's kneeling on one leg. Other foot is going to come out in front of him. Okay? And same thing here. He's trying to push his knee out over his toe. Now, if you find the back hip limiting, you can kind of open up that hip. So, you know, like Adam, I'll just actually just show super quick. He's here. If this hip is limiting or this leg's limiting, you can just open it to the side so you can really push the knee over the toe. If you find that your Achilles is really resistant, it's a really strong tendon, you can use a dumbbell, or you could even put your elbow and kind of like you see here and lean into it to really help push the knee over the toe. The other thing that's super important is that you're actually thinking about pulling the toes to the knee, so you're using the tibialis muscle here to you're actually going to strengthen it isometrically by thinking about pulling that knee over. So you should feel a good contraction through the front of the shin as well. That's going to help improve the ankle mobility. It's not just having the flexibility here as much as it is important that you have the strength through the front of the ankle to use that range. So that would be your fisherman stretch. So now we're going to go into standing pancake stretch. So Adam will stand. He's going to straddle his legs probably about 90 degrees, okay? So most guys, you're pretty much trying to go as wide as you can with the legs here. Now, if you find that you have an extremely flexible groin and hip area, to the point where you feel like you're almost just working on middle splits, that's not exactly what we want. We don't necessarily want to feel it right on the inside of the groin. We kind of want it back slightly on the inner hamstring. Toes forward or toes slightly turned out. It's kind of up to you to find where the everyone's hip anatomy is slightly different. So, find what's comfortable for you. And then from here, you're going to hinge forward at the hip. And you can use your hands. Again, if you're super tight, you can use a block to kind of help you. Being a little rounded is fine, but if you find that you're not getting a good stretch here, you want to think about just kind of like extending your spine a little bit, and then also compressing and bringing your abs down towards your thighs here. So a little rounding through the low back is going to be really normal, especially as you get flexible. You're not going to really be able to get to the floor and keep your back super straight as long as you keep your chest up. That's the most important factor here. Keeping the weight in the ball of the foot and not in the heel is also going to help increase the stretch. So again, you're going to feel this more on the inner part of the hamstring, close to where it meets the adductor. So it will be kind of like inner back side of the leg here. And he would hold that for 2 minutes, making sure to breathe. So that's really good. And then eventually you can just go down. You can work getting down towards your elbows or whatever. And you can play with the width a little bit on this. Like I said, everyone's hips are a little different. So if you wanted to, you can go a little wider. Some guys are going to be less flexible, a little bit more narrow. You don't want to go too much more narrow than 90 degrees, but you don't want to go super, super wide where you feel like you're going to slide out into like a side split. Okay, so kind of find your area of where you feel it and you don't feel blocked in the front of the hip. If you feel blocked in the front of the hip, you're going to have to work on feet in, feet out, or a little bit wider, more narrow based on your hip anatomy. So that would be the standing pancake. Now the next one, you will need a wall, or if you find it really hard to get into this position, you're gonna want something to elevate the butt on. I have faith that Adam's not gonna need that. So he's just gonna go sit straight against the wall for this one. The reason I like the wall is because it gives you some feedback and keeps you really honest with this movement. So he's gonna bring this is the tailor's pose. He's gonna bring his bottom of his feet together, knees apart. All right? Yeah, good. So this is really good. So what the wall is gonna allow you to do is keep your head and your back and everything against the wall. That's gonna keep you really honest so you're not like rounded over. And also so you're not excessively arching the low back. And then from here, he's gonna actually use the outside of his hips and think about pulling the knees down towards the floor. Okay, if you wanted to, you could use light weight to assist by propping them up on the knees. For some guys who are really, really tight, it's gonna be necessary. For a lot, it won't be necessary. You could even just put your hands on the inside of your knees and lightly assist. Remember, we're not trying to force it down, we're just trying to assist. We wanna make sure that the outside of the hips are contributing greatly to increasing the flexibility of our groin. So he's using the outside of his glutes. You could do light pulses, or you could just hold a static hold for the entire duration, or you can mix it up. Really, either one, you can play with both. Again, just remember the most important thing I cannot talk about enough is using the musculature of the outside of the hips to increase the flexibility of the groin. So you really want to make sure that you're using your glutes. You should almost feel like they're going to cramp up, and the next day, if you're doing it right, they're probably going to be sore. Okay? So that's going to be the tailor's pose. Again, if you're super tight, if he wanted to, he could sit on some pads, or he could sit on blocks, or whatever. That's just going to shift your center of mass forward slightly, so it just gives you a little bit better leverage on getting into that position. And then once you can get the knees down, like you see here, like they're pretty horizontal, then you can just lower the thing down. But I see a lot of guys, they get into it, and their knees are literally up here, and you're just not doing yourself any favors like that. If you look like that, elevate the hips first. There's nothing wrong with elevating the hips to get into the stretch. And then as you get more flexible and the pelvis can roll forward and you can get the chest up, then you can just keep lowering yourself to the floor. Eventually the end goal would be to just have the knees to the floor. Okay, so that's perfect 180 degrees of hip abduction. So the knees away from the hips. That's really good. So next, we're gonna go into hips elevated pancake stretch. So if you guys have been following along a lot of our programs, or you guys are probably familiar with the pancake stretch, we just did it standing. Even if you're super advanced, I like elevating the hips for the pancake stretch for the same reason as the tailor's pose, is it allows you to push the center of mass forward. So I'm actually gonna have Adam sit up on the blocks, probably this way, just so he's not limited. He's gonna sit, you can just face forward. Same thing here. Okay, so what he's going to do is he's going to straighten out his knees and straddle them as wide as he can apart. Okay, you're going to want to sit somewhat towards the front edge, but don't sit too far on the front edge, because once the hips start rolling forward, you'll slide off of your object. Okay, so very important that the knees are locked out here, so he's squeezing his quads. Okay, toes, however you can point them, you can keep them straight up. It doesn't really matter. Then from here, what he's trying to do is basically you want to think about coming forward and down, not just straight down. If Adam were just to go straight down, he's just going to hunch over. It might work for a little while, but as you get more flexible, you're going to find that you kind of want to reach just slightly out and away as well. So using your hands to kind of crawl yourself out and away from your body, I find that works best, especially when you start to get limited. Again, if you're feeling blocked here, bringing your legs slightly forward or a little wider, you're going to have to play with that. Also, you can see that Adam's knees are actually pretty much straight up towards the ceiling. That's really good. Some people might find that they need to rotate the hips out more to get a little bit more stretch. Some might find that their hips start to internally rotate a little bit more. Again, that's highly dependent upon your hip anatomy and your femur and socket relationship. So don't get too carried away with that. There's no really right or wrong. as long as there's not an extreme one way or the other. Some direction towards the ceiling is good. Again, let it kind of naturally do what it wants to do. You don't have to worry about forcing that too much. And then over time, the goal would eventually be to get, I would say, you know, forehead down first, and then your nose, and then your chin, and then eventually being able to get like your shoulders down to the floor. That's going to be more flexibility in this than most of you guys will need, but this is really good. Again, as you get, if the back can get below 45 degrees, you can start to decrease the height of the object if you wanted to. So you can take one pad off. Yeah, I mean, this is really good stretch. I mean, he's doing really well. His flexibility is really good here. So, you know, I find that even if you can go chest to floor, which I can, a lot of the guys here at ATG can, you still benefit from sitting your hips up. And the reason is because it pushes the center of mass slightly forward, so it just allows you to get into a better position. Even if you can do it on the floor, you're still gonna get a lot of benefit from elevating the hips at least slightly when you do this stretch. And then once you get through it or get to the end of it, if you wanna remove the object and really feel out how you are near the floor, that's good. But a lot of guys start this out, they don't actually get a stretch through the groin, they just feel it through here, and that's why. They can't get the hips to actually like roll over, and you can see the hip shift slightly forward. They just hunch over from the low back, so it just creates a lot of stress because you're trying to stretch your low back instead of stretching the inside of the thighs, which is really what we're working on here. So that's really good. So we'll give them a break for a second. We got a few more left. The next stretch is horse stance. Now this is gonna be a little different than most of the stretches you've done, because this is gonna be a little bit more of an active isometric stretch than it's actually gonna be just like a more like a static stretching that you've been doing. So the horse stance is unique because it's used in martial arts. So if Adam wants to just stand facing the camera, there's a couple ways to do this. The end goal is going to be 7 steps, and I'll show you what I mean by that. But for now, and I'm pretty sure Adam can do 7 steps, but for now we're going to show 5. So what he's going to do is he's going to start with both feet together, okay? He's going to toe out both as far as he can. That would be 1, and then he's going to heel out. That's 2, 3, 4, and then 5, okay? Again, everyone's hip anatomy is a little different. You want to try to maintain the torso as vertical as possible. Again, if you feel like block in the hips, you can lean forward slightly. You just don't want to be completely bent over or like hunched over. You want to remain as extended as possible. From here, you want the knees to track out over the toes, and the goal is to sit as low as you can and hold that position. So if you just stop it parallel for me, he can actually go deeper than parallel in 5, but that would be the hold. So you want to think about actively contracting the glutes to pull the knees out, and the adductors here are actually really focusing on, they're also contracting isometrically to hold the position. And as you can see, I wrote 60 to 120. Find a depth that you can hold for 60 seconds, build up to 2 minutes in that depth before moving on. Okay, so we'll let him come out of this for a second because I want him to be able to show 7-step. The biggest thing is, actually real quick, go as deep as you can. As the hips sink below the knees, that's how you know it's time to go wider if you can hold it for 120 seconds. Okay, so stand up. Now I'll tell you why that's important. When the hips go into flexion, so when the angle between the thigh and the torso closes, all right? Once you hit below parallel, the hips actually have to internally rotate. So to get the most movement out of your hip, if you think of like a deep squat or something like that, when you hit full depth, okay, the hips actually have to internally rotate to allow space in the hip socket to train. Now, a lot of guys come from a football background where they squat more powerlifting style, where they only squat to parallel. So the hip abductors, like the outside of the hips, that's where those are most responsible. So you're focusing on using those to keep the knees tracked out until you hit parallel. When you hit below parallel, the hips actually have to slightly internally rotate. So that's why we focus on just going to parallel, and then we're gonna take the feet wider. So I'll show you here. Now he's gonna just toe out 1, 2 more times, so now he's really wide, okay? And now he's gonna try to sit as deep as he can and really focus on, yeah, that's really good here. So Adam's just basically gonna build up to being able to hold this for 2 minutes, and it should be unwavering tension. What I mean is you should be able to just drop into this and hold it without doing a lot of shaking, okay? So it should be relatively effortless in terms of the intensity. So he would hold this, and as you can see, the outside of his glutes firing really hard to keep that knee in line with his toe. And as you can see, if he were to drop any lower, his hip actually has to start rotating in slightly to allow room for the hip to sit into the socket. So if he just wants to come up just a hair, that's good there. You could put like a broomstick or something across your lap to keep you honest. You can probably come out of that unless you want to keep holding it. You know, you can use like a broomstick or something to keep honest. So if it sits right on the quads, you know that you're at the right height. If it rolls down into your hips, you know that you're too low. And if it rolls off the front of the quads, you know that you're too high. So it's very important that the hip and the knee are in line for the stretch as much as you can get. Again, you're working up to 2 minutes in the lowest range that you possibly can. Like I said, for this, I would build at whatever range you're working at. Don't get to a low range and only be able to hold it for 60 seconds and then think that move on. No, you want to be able to, big part of this is actually building up the strength to hold that position. I know a lot of positions in football you have to get really low, so it's going to be important that you have strength there. And not only do you have strength there, but you have endurance there, so you're able to do it for an extended period of time. So that was really good, Adam. And now we're going to move on to the last few stretches. Diamond pose. He's going to have a seat. And you can probably face me for this one. It'll show best on camera. It's similar to the Taylor's pose where he's going to have the feet together, except now he's not trying to pull the heels to the groin. As you can see, the legs make a diamond. You can even push away like the heels as much as you can keep the feet together. Okay? And from here, he's actually going to tuck his chin into his chest and then curl over. Think about trying to bring the top of your head almost like to the arches of your feet, and you're going to feel like a nice stretch to this whole posterior chain from the neck all the way down to the low back. Some guys might even get a hamstring stretch. That's okay, that's normal, especially if the hamstrings are a little more inflexible than other people. You will feel it a little bit to the outside of that hamstring. Really, we use this not only to stretch the low back, but to relax it after doing the horse stance for such an extended period. You're so extended that it's just going to allow you a chance to kind of to relax that low back. And believe it or not, actually stretch. You'll get a lot of guys that are really tight through their neck right here, so this is going to really help kind of stretch that part out. That's all there really is to it. This one is just 90 seconds. Just relax, just breathe, really stretch out that low back. You know, allow the knees to just kind of do what they want to do. And again, as the hips get more flexible, these might go down even more towards the floor. That's not really the point. The point is just really focusing on this part of your back here. So that's really good.
Feels really good.
Yeah, that's like the best way to finish. Now, I added 90-90 internal and external rotation just because in this series in particular, you're working so much on the hips. I like to do this at the end just to kind of allow the hips to rotate and move because they've spent so much time contracting. So Adam's going to get into his 90-90 position here. Okay, actually, let's rotate your body towards the camera just because you're going to do both from this position, so I might as well show. Good. So it's called the 90-90 stretch because obviously the knee here and the knee here are both at 90 degrees. You know, don't be religious about it. As long as it's within like 5 or 10 degrees or so, that's fine. Okay. Part one of this stretch is going to be to rotate the torso towards the front thigh and then kind of bringing your torso down if needed, okay, to feel the stretch in the outside of the hip. Again, if you're having trouble, something else that can be done, we're not going to show it, but he could elevate his hips on a block or on a pad if he needed to, especially if this other hip is really tight, you might need to do that in order to focus on the stretch. As you can see, Adam is rotated towards that thigh. So if he were to rotate kind of away, he's probably not going to feel it as much. So you really want to rotate and try to get your chest just down the thigh. You don't have to really go too much more than that. This should be sufficient for most guys. As you open up over time, if you want to on this stretch, you can start to straighten out the back leg. Now this is going to be highly dependent on what that looks like in the first series. How flexible is your hip flexor? Because if your hip flexor is not that flexible, you're not really gonna get a lot out of this version. But as both improve, you can work on doing this, and then he could also work on sitting up if you really wanted to. And that's really good. So that's for the outside of the hip. So we'll have him bring this leg back in. So you hold that for 2 minutes on that side. Okay, the hips are big muscles, so it takes a lot of time to allow them to kind of open up. And now we're gonna do internal rotation. Okay, so he's gonna rotate his chest now towards the back leg. So this, for a lot of guys, is going to be way tighter. Just go ahead and I want you to just sit up.
Sure.
So for like the first one we can lay down, this one you're actually gonna be up as much as possible, trying to rotate towards this leg. As you can see here, his is actually pretty good because his glute is relatively, is pretty much on the ground, okay? A lot of you guys might find that when you first do this, that your hips like really rotated and up off the floor. You wanna think about sitting that glute down, and I'm sure, I'll let Adam describe it, but the sensation should be kind of deep in the hip capsule. It can be on either side and kind of run along.
Yeah, so I'm definitely getting right on the outside of this hip capsule, and then also a groin stretcher as well.
Yep.
Yeah.
So the adductor and your groin muscle actually are internal rotators. The glute medius that runs along the outside of the hip here is also an internal rotator. So you're kind of working on the whole joint capsule as far as its ability to rotate inwards, which is just as important, if not more important, than its ability to rotate outwards. So this is a stretch that you probably won't see in many other places. But again, the idea is to be able to sit both glutes down on the floor, hips square, and to be able to rotate this all the way in. If you get knee pain on the inside of your knee when you do this stretch, again, you can elevate, you can sit up on a block, because you might find that you're really restricted here. You could sit up on a block and really focus on rotating that leg in, and then as you get more flexible, yeah, you'll see a lot of guys when they start this, they're gonna look like that. That hip's gonna wanna kind of rotate forward, and they're gonna be all crunched up here. So I find that a lot of guys, if they have back problems on one particular side, they don't have as much internal rotation, so they overuse that QL to kind of try to rotate that hip. So sit the glute down, and again, 2 minutes, and then obviously you would just switch both legs and then do the same thing on the other side, and that completes the stretch there, so it's really good.